Why is New Caledonia French, and since when has it been? Why does this island located in Oceania have such a special place within the French Republic? What treatment was historically given to the Kanak population living on the island at the time of the French arrival? I propose an objective exploration of the history of an extraordinary French territory, based on reliable sources and avoiding biased positions. Who were the original inhabitants of the island? So, to get back to New Caledonia, who exactly are the original inhabitants of the island? Well, it's important to understand that the settlement of the island is actually relatively recent. Australia was populated over 30,000 years ago by Asians, the ancestors of the Aboriginal population, while New Caledonia was only populated in 1100 before Christ. During a second wave of migration that populated the various Pacific islands, known as Melanesian, which were believed to be unoccupied until then. This migration is made up of people of Lapita culture, resulting from a mix between the populations previously settled in Australia and a new wave of migration from Southeast Asia, probably from southern China. To help you place the time in 1100 before Christ, over 14 centuries have passed since the construction of the famous Khufu pyramid in Egypt, marking the decline of the once powerful pharaonic civilization. The island is thus occupied by a mixed-race population, arriving relatively late on the scene. These populations are the ancestors of the Kanaks. They settle there and quickly become sedentary, taking advantage of a particularly favorable climate that allows them to cultivate the land, which then allows them to develop, as well as the establishment of social structures based on a kind of clan or chieftainship system in small countries, somewhat like what was the case, for example, in Scotland. It is this relatively recent settlement, far from primitive or disorganized, that occupies New Caledonia. Europeans first officially arrived on the island in the 18th century. On September 4th, 1774, the British explorer James Cook lands on the island at a place called Ballad. He then names the island New Caledonia. And why this name? The island reminds him of Scotland. The name Caledonia being the ancient name of what was roughly the current Scottish territory, the French, then keep this name and name the island New Caledonia. This does not mean that the island actually comes under British control. It then remains in practice away from foreign ambitions, and this despite initial contacts that are generally peaceful, but the consequences of which are disastrous for the Kanaks due to diseases. Yes, because several epidemics of flu, tuberculosis, or even measles lead to a collapse of the territory's population, weakening the island's economy, as much as its societies. When Europeans create the first sustainable trading posts in the mid-19th century, both founded by the British and the French, the situation of the local societies is then catastrophic, even before the Europeans start wanting to take control of the island. Imagine a crisis like the COVID pandemic, but 5 times more severe and recurring in rapid succession. This mechanically creates societal upheaval on the island, similar to the impact of the Black Plague in the Middle Ages. In France, and as a result of this situation, many tasks such as agricultural work are no longer carried out or are incomplete, and positions within the various Kanak societies of the time are unoccupied, unable to be replaced due to the numerous deaths. This destabilized social structures caused terrible famines, and as a result, led to migrations that were sometimes violent within the island itself. The succession of epidemics meant that none of these societies really had time to recover. But despite this health disaster that severely impacted the strength of the Kanak societies as much as their development, the European occupation of the island is not that simple, as we will see. But then, who were the first foreigners to truly colonize the island? Well, the first real colonist is not a Frenchman, but a Brit named James Padden, who is the first to establish one, then several small trading posts in the area. He keeps one off the coast of New Island, near present-day Noumea. And what about the French? Well, on their side, the first French to settle are Catholic missionaries, who landed in New Caledonia in 1843. Despite converting some of the population they interact with, the first missionaries are temporarily expelled. 4 years later, it seems, after several incidents related to food sharing in a context of famine on the island. However, they returned the following year to continue their mission. These missionaries plant a crucial seed for the future, as the converts are relatively abundant and will play a significant role later. However, from 1850 onwards, the French grew more interested in the island. There are two reasons for this. First, the geographical location would allow France to establish a presence in a region where it currently has limited influence. Yes, because the nearest French settlement is over 310.689 miles away in French Polynesia. And the other interest is that France is looking to establish a penal colony that would allow it to exile common law criminals. As much as the political opponents it wants to eliminate, while permitting the establishment and development of a colony on the other side of the world. This is how, following the massacre of a French crew by a Kanak clan during an exploration mission, the French have both diplomatic and political pretexts justifying a colonial effort in New Caledonia. September 24, 1853, Rear Admiral Février Despointes, commander of the French naval forces in the Pacific, takes possession of New Caledonia on behalf of France and its Emperor Napoleon III, while adhering to the international law procedures of the time, which were only recognized by European and North American states. Surprisingly, the French are ill-informed about the island's economic potential, which has little influence on their decision to occupy it. Thus, the excellent agricultural potential of the territory is largely masked due to the collapse of local societies, which has led to terrible famines, while the island's mineral wealth is only identified several years after the French have settled. Thus, as early as the following year, in 1854, a military establishment called Port de France was founded, which was later renamed Noumea, the current capital of the territory. In the early years, the island is administratively part of French Polynesia, with very limited resources in practice, due to its secondary place in the French arrangements in this part of the world. France does not yet control the island, where various Kanak chieftaincies reside, their societies seriously weakened by successive epidemics. In fact, real French authority is limited in the early years to Port de France itself, where there is a garrison of about 100 men, whose number only allows for the defense and occupation of the Noumea Peninsula on which it is located, in a spirit of appeasement as much as to facilitate relations with the local population. The governor of the island guaranteed in 1855 the property of the Kanaks as being their own. Only unoccupied lands fall under the authority of the state and can be occupied by settlers, a doctrine that is confirmed by the Minister of the Navy and Colonies and approved by Emperor Napoleon III himself, giving instruction, I quote, to avoid the slightest infringement on the property of the natives. The French settlement initially relies primarily on the Kanaks themselves due to limited human resources. Several clans, particularly those converted by Catholic missionaries, associate with the French. Despite this, clashes occur, with some clans rejecting French authority, while others have shifting loyalties. Despite scares, the French maintain their presence on the island, and this is thanks to the indispensable help of Kanak auxiliaries from clans allied with France. This enabled the French to settle on this remote island, located 17 miles from the mainland. And what about the idea of penal colonies? Well, following French Guiana, it is indeed New Caledonia that was chosen in 1863, 10 years after taking possession of the island, to set up forced labor establishments reserved for certain common law criminals and political opponents. The island serves as a prison and a destination for deported individuals with comparable backgrounds. 4,000 Paris Commune insurgents, including the famous Louise Michel, are sent there, including activists and rebels from colonized territories, especially the Maghreb. Thus, in just over 30 years, from 1864 to 1897, 2,000 Maghrebians, mostly Algerians, are deported to the island, and many of them settle there. Convicts and deportees comprise the majority of workers on infrastructure clearing sites and in mines. Some of them are also granted so-called penitentiary concessions, which are in practice lands that they clear and exploit and then receive in their own name once their sentence has been served. The aim was to expand the colonial settlement on the island. However, settlement is not without conflicts. France's occupation of the island lasted several decades, relying both on voluntary civil settlement and on the penal settlement just mentioned. However, the French presence gradually becomes more and more intrusive and confiscatory towards the Kanak populations. The situation is worsened by an uncontrolled surge in settlers. The administration poorly controls the situation, lacking means to enforce order while sometimes allowing or tolerating the looting, whether intentionally or not. This progression of colonial settlement is embodied by what is called the frontier, that is, the progression of European presence. Starting essentially from Noumea, first in all directions, then towards the north. The stance of the Kanak clans varies significantly throughout this process. While some Kanak clans contribute to this settlement, others, typically those most affected by the spoliations, oppose it, or they become so. Others are resigned and, without contributing to the French effort, let it happen. It is essentially this anarchic progression, sometimes violent, without any law or rule being firmly implemented, which causes numerous armed conflicts between the newcomers and the indigenous population. In fact, in 1862, the legal situation of the Kanaks deteriorates when all the lands of the island are considered as directly dependent on the authority of the French government, disregarding the rights of the Kanaks, which were, in theory, respected until then, as previously mentioned. However, the risk of armed confrontation pushes the authorities to revise their copy in 1868, recognizing Kanak properties and assigning them a better regulated status. From then on, they are grouped into tribes, a status invented by the authorities as it does not truly reflect the Kanak's way of life, and chiefs are appointed by the colonial authority. These chiefs are given French officer uniforms and must relay French authority to local populations. It is then the tribes and not the individuals who own delimited lands and are in principle guaranteed by the French authorities. In theory, these areas are legally protected reserves and sanctuaries that settlers are not allowed to touch, similar to Native American reserves in North America. However, the implementation of these rules is subject to ambiguity perpetuated by the law and the inefficiency, sometimes willful, of the Caledonian colonial administration. The racialist and racist perspectives of the time also add to this gloomy atmosphere that could only end in one way: the armed conflict between the newcomers on one hand and the Kanaks on the other hand. The early years of French occupation of the island were characterized by skirmishes and violent conflicts, the climax of which is the Great Kanak Revolt of 1878. Several dispossessed Kanak clans rebel against the occupier during this uprising, but they face a now well-established French state, supported both by European settlers of all origins and by a large part of the convicts, and deportees, notably Algerians, who were also targeted by the rebels. This coalition of colonial interests, led by France, subjects the Kanaks to extremely brutal repression. The Kanaks triggered the uprising by murdering civilians, men, women, and children. France continues effective guerrilla operations while launching a brutal colonial retaliation. Many insurgent villages, or those that supported insurgents, are razed, crops are destroyed, and civilians are captured and then deported, or in some cases massacred by poorly controlled troops. However, the insurgents initially managed to seriously destabilize the colonial government of Noumea, who, however, manages to effectively concentrate his war effort, allowing him to gradually defeat the insurgent clans one after the other. In June 1879, the French efforts have succeeded, and the last major insurgent Kanak clans are defeated. France now truly controls New Caledonia. The takeover enables the colony's development, leading to abundant exploitation of its agricultural and mining resources, attracting Polynesian, Asian, and European workers, many of whose descendants still live on the island today. Since then, how has the situation been for the Kanaks? Has it improved or stayed the same? Fortunately, yes, but it took time. At first, the Kanaks were under the indigenous regime, which was somewhat adapted to the island's realities by successive governors, which is a regime that applies exclusively to non-European populations dependent on the French colonial empire. In practice, it is a system of rules and laws that are outside of French law. But less than a century after the occupation of the island, an event reshuffles the cards and will restore many rights to the Kanak. Yes, it is World War II. This definitively reshuffles the cards when New Caledonia refuses the armistice signed in mainland by Marshal Pétain. From June 24, 1940, it decides to continue the war alongside General Charles de Gaulle's Free France. A militia of 2,000 men is formed to defend the island, while the following year, 280 New Caledonians leave the island and join the Pacific Battalion, composed of Polynesians, New Hebrides, and of course New Caledonians. This battalion fights in major battles for Free France, including Bir Hakeim and the Allied landing in Provence. The commitment and change in doctrine within the liberated French state's highest spheres led the island's governor to end the indigenous regime from June 1945. Kanaks and immigrants are no longer considered second-class citizens under a separate law in the former colonies. From this point, New Caledonia slowly transforms into a territory with democratic and specific functioning, tailored to its geographical realities and the history of its settled populations. Thus, the Kanaks gradually receive French nationality, giving them the same rights as any French citizen, and are involved in the governance of an island that is itself, as early as 1946. Represented in the National Assembly by a deputy, New Caledonia then experiences several decades of prosperity and full employment, notably driven by the nickel boom, which is a mineral found on the island. Prosperity that attracts even more immigrants, both European and Asian, or even from the Pacific Islands. Consequently, the Kanak population still represented 52% of the island's inhabitants. In 1951, it only represented 42% in 1976. The Kanak population share has remained stable, representing just over 41% of the total population in 2019. Despite common belief, only 24% of New Caledonia's residents are of European descent today. The remaining third of the population consists of mixed-race individuals, descendants of Asian Pacific Islanders, or descendants of deportees from the former French colonial empire. The colonial era of Lille has understandably influenced the city's economic situation and social structures. This legacy has generated new disturbances during the 80s, which then led to the 30-year pact between the supporters of Lille's independence on one hand and the loyalists on the other hand. The outcome of this recently known pact has culminated in 3 referendums triggered by the Congress of New Caledonia, asking Lille residents whose electorate was defined to favor long-term residents to vote for or against independence. Thus, on 3 occasions, the New Caledonians have democratically and clearly expressed their wish to continue to link their destiny with the destiny of France. I hope this video has helped you understand the unique history of this island that has recently been in the news. If you like this kind of topic, let me know in the comments. Most importantly, click the bell icon to subscribe and never miss future documentaries on this channel. I invite you to watch the next video, which you'll definitely find interesting since you stayed until the end of this one.